guys. Let's start the second class. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Miguel Lurgi Rivera. Miguel describes himself as a computational ecologist, which is very true. Miguel got a bachelor degree in computer engineering from Universidad Simón Bolívar in Venezuela. After that, Miguel got a master's degree in evolutionary and adaptive systems from the University of Sussex, and another master's degree in research in artificial intelligence from the University of Edinburgh, both in the UK. And then a PhD from the Autonomous University of Barcelona in Spain. Before becoming a before becoming a senior lecturer at the Swansea University in the UK, he did a postdoc at the University of Adelaide in Australia and at the CNRS in France. In his research, Miguel focused on the development of ecological theory and the analysis of large data sets to gain a better understanding of community assembling and ecological patterns of species distributions and interactions in complex natural communities. He also tries to understand the mechanisms behind the emergence of complexity in ecological networks and the development of theoretical models of community and network dynamics, linking the mechanisms to the partners they give rise to. So help me to welcome Professor Miguel.
Hello? Hello? Okay, cool. Cool. Well, thank you very much, Flavio, for that kind introduction. I guess that I should write a little bit less about these complex things on my bio because it's too complex. So yeah, as Flavia said, I have been doing different things on ecological modeling, especially from a computational point of view. And I have also been doing some data analysis of complex communities, from terrestrial vertebrate networks to marine intertidal communities along the coast of Chile, microbiome inside marine sponges, and all sort of things. And yeah, today I want to, I will build up on, not only today, but during the week, I will try to build up on some of the concepts that Paulo taught you last week. It's good for you to have those concepts in mind, because sometimes I will sort of assume that you know them, but if not, or you don't remember, just feel free to ask whatever. Yeah, so basically following up on that, I will try to, continue with the community and biodiversity theme, but using a more sort of network approach, right? And before starting to do that, I wanted to, I want to share a little bit of what is the focus of what we are going to do here, right? What I'm gonna try to talk about during these 5 lectures. The focus is basically this, which are complex ecosystems made up of many species, and not only the species themselves, but also their interactions. So in these things, there is a lot of competition going on, both intra and intra-specific. You guys remember what is the difference between intra and inter-specific competition, right? Yeah, I think Paulo gave an entire lecture about that. So, and in both of these places, there is a lot of diversity and a lot of interactions going on. And in particular, I am very interested in understanding how we go from communities that seem like a random collection of things, like this over here, what might seem a random collection of species, or a bunch of things together. How do we go from something like this to something like this? I know that these two things seem equally complicated or even equally random, but in this picture on the right, which is a simplified version of the North Atlantic food web, there is structure. So we can count things here, and that is the difference. So in here, we can count properties, we can describe this as a mathematical object. And one of the things that we will be doing during this week is actually like learning a little bit more how to do that. How to take an object like this as an abstraction of an ecosystem and just, you know, count, quantify it and how do you say that? And describe it in quantitative ways that will allow us to not only understand better how the systems are structured, but also to try to develop models and some kind of data analysis techniques to better understand them. And by doing that, we will be, one of the things that I like doing for my research is to try to understand the mechanisms that give rise to these structural patterns, and then also to flip the coin and using models like that, try to predict what will happen when they are exposed to different kind of perturbations. These kind of perturbations might be, you know, warming, extinctions, invasions, overexploitation, and other different kind of things. So we also will be talking a little bit about that, and I will provide, I will show a few examples of things that, you know, that I have done and, well, that other people has done as well to tackle these problems. We will be looking at this from a sort of mixed ecological theory / computational ecology kind of perspective, in which we will be looking at simple models like this to try to, you know, as I said, not only understand mechanisms, but also try to make predictions. And we will mix this with some analysis of empirical data. So I will also show you some examples on how to do this, and you know, like, yeah, we will learn through doing these things. Yeah, I guess one other thing to mention about this empirical data analysis is that it's about like many species and their interactions. So in this particular example here, it's like how, in case you are wondering, these are networks of intertidal animals living along the coast of the South Pacific. And this is the geographical variation in terms of the sea surface temperature that they experience. And in here, we are trying to look for geographical patterns in the structure of these networks and why that happens. So to be able to do this or to achieve this, I guess, interesting, I hope interesting for you guys, these interesting goals, I have structured like our 5 lectures into like 5 different topics, a bit different, but they overlap to some extent. So we will start today with like a very sort of technical talk or presentation about, you know, what is a network, how we represent things as networks, and how to analyze networks in general, and also ecological networks in particular, which is, you know, the kind of networks we are interested in. Ecological networks are those in which links or edges between nodes represent ecological interactions. I realize that, you know, for some of you, this might be like a little basic, so bear with me on that. It's just to make sure that we bring up to speed everyone like to the same level that we are gonna need for the other lectures. But, you know, I hope it will be equally fun. And from then we will start building up on that knowledge to go to try to understand better how we can use network tools to understand the assembly of ecological networks across spatial scales. So one of the things I am interested in is how the shape of a network changes from local to regional scales. And we will be talking about some ecological theory from back in the day about how species richness first changes with scale, and then how we take that to networks. That's really cool, right? And then we are going to learn a little bit about how we can use this network perspective to better understand what are the effects, or what have been and predicted to be effects of global change on natural communities. By global change, I mean a mixture of different perturbations, like the ones we were talking about before. So global change is basically all of the changes that communities, natural communities are experiencing due to anthropogenic actions. So it's not only warming, but it's also invasions, habitat loss, extinctions, and all of that stuff. Then we are going to look a little bit about how we can use models like the ones I will be talking about to engineer ecological applications. In particular, we will be looking at the management of invasive species, and I will talk a little bit about the management of disease spread in wildlife populations in meta-communities, which is like a nice little project that one of my master's students did a while ago. And then at the end, I'm gonna move up to like even more complex communities. I thought that you guys might find interesting to know about how to use networks to, in this case, tackle a more complex community, which is the microbiome. So we will learn a little bit of what is the microbiome and so on, and then how to use networks to look at the microbiome. So my teaching philosophy is that I don't really believe in me telling you things all the time just to a wall, and I would really like this to be very interactive, right? I would really like for you guys to ask me any questions, or even if you don't have questions, if you want to say something, whatever it is, I would prefer that very much, even without having to say to the microphone, because it's like annoying. So just go ahead and say whatever you want at any point during the lecture. This is not even like a formal thing, because as you will see, I haven't like prepared any slides or anything. What I did instead was, so you don't have to also worry about taking notes or anything, I put everything here. So in that website, you are going to find all of the stuff that, and as a matter of fact, what I will be doing is just going over that and like drawing things here on the board. And yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say as an introduction, or I think so. Well, anyway, this website is under construction because I am still like fixing some details for the lectures after, but it will stay there, remain there. And for those of you who are interested in like, the code and how to build a website like that and all that, all of my code is freely available, and you can find it in my GitHub, so you can actually see how I did this page. And yeah, I guess feel free to reuse whatever you want. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I'm gonna now switch to the, do you have any questions about any of these, or anything you would like to say? Something that you would like to, oh yeah, that's another thing I should say. This, as I said, this is not, I don't have like a strict content that I need to deliver. I am just like putting together things that I thought might be interesting for you. So if you think that you would like to hear more about something in particular, just let me know. And oh yeah, and the other thing I wanted to mention is that I don't know if they sent you these things, but I proposed some like pre-reading material for this week, which were some papers about some of the things that we will be talking about. So if you read those or are interested in reading them and you have any questions or want to, discuss the papers or whatever, let me know as well, and we will find the time to do that. Cool. So. Cool. So the website pretty much looks like this, and then if you go to get started, well, you're gonna find a bunch of like instructions and things to do before. Does this work if I? No. Okay. So one of the things that the way in which I have structured these lectures is that for you guys to not lose interest, I have put a lot of code during, in between things, so you can actually be doing things while we talk. And you are going to find like the pieces of code there that you can run in your machines if you want. If you don't want to, the results of all of those codes are displayed on the web pages. But just for you to see, because I thought it would be interesting for you to see how to do the things that I'm gonna be talking about. I thought that might be cool for you to see. So for this, I have relied on R to do this. So all of the codes in there are written in R, and to be able to run them, obviously, you're going to have R installed in your computers. I normally use RStudio because it's easy to, copy things yeah, for those of you who have never used R before, here are the links to install R in the housekeeping section of the first page, and also to install RStudio. And then there is this example here of how I'm going to present the code in the following pages. So every time you see a little box like this, inside there is the code that you can run. And in this particular example here, this is an example of how to install a library in R. So if you try to run the code and it doesn't work, like more than 0.5% of the times is because you don't have the right libraries, as I'm sure you know. This is how you install libraries in R. So you can just use that. And we are going to be heavily relying on a specific library that is called iGraph for network analysis. So that probably should be the first package that you install for being able to do the other stuff. And yeah, I guess that lastly, well, for navigation, you can always follow the links on the left menu. As I said, there are going to be some broken links. Some of the pages are still not, so the ones that we are going to be working on the specific day are finished. But if you want to see the future ones, they are still in progress. And yeah, well, I would like also to thank Ricardo and the organization for having me here, and you guys for being here and listening to me. So I hope that you enjoy these few days, and again, just feel free to say whatever you want. So we're gonna do today the first lecture, which is about network structure. So how many of you here have already worked or heard of networks? More or less everyone, okay. So I guess that in that case, I apologize in advance because this might be a bit boring for you. But as I said, I think it would be fair enough to refresh content, and also for those of you who haven't seen it to actually learn it. So basically, a network is a very simple thing. It's just a representation of things, whatever is the thing in your domain of study, just entities or elements that within the network literature we call vertices or nodes. So in the traditional sort of graph theory from mathematics, which is from where all of these concepts come from, the network is defined as a set of nodes or vertices connected by links, which are sometimes also called edges, right? So yeah, this is a network. Then within a network, there might be well, not within a network, sorry. Networks can be of different kinds. So if you have, if you can tell the directionality of your link and that information is of interest for you, for example, in ecological networks, that information is sometimes interesting because, for example, in a predator-prey interaction, so in a food web, you are interested in knowing from which species to which species the flow of biomass or energy is flowing. So if that is the case and you are interested in representing the information, then you have what we call directed networks or directed graphs, in which basically to represent them you just draw an arrow on the edge, and it symbolizes, that the information or the biomass or whatever you are studying, it's, flowing from one node to another. Then the other sort of classification of networks that will be, there might be many other classifications of networks, but the other one that concerns us directly here is a classification of whether a network is unipartite or bipartite. So when a network is unipartite, basically all nodes can be connected to any other nodes in the network. And something happened to my computer. Cool. So the second type of network in this classification is what we call bipartite networks, which are probably the ones that Paulo introduced to you last week, because he works a lot on those kind of networks. In bipartite networks, you can split the network into two sets of nodes in which there are connections between nodes across the groups, so between nodes in different groups, but there are no connections between nodes inside the same group. So you have this group here, which is connected to nodes on this group, but there are no connections between them. In ecological networks, we are interested sometimes in unipartite networks, like for example, for food webs, when we try to mix different types of interactions and things like that. And sometimes we are interested in bipartite networks because they are a more natural representation of, for example, plant pollinator systems or host parasite interactions. And the difference between these two things is basically that we can quantify different properties on here and here. So we would be interested in, for example, in bipartite networks. We are interested in something that is called nestedness, and the ratio between nodes in one level to another, and something like that. And stuff like that. Sorry. Since in unipartite networks you cannot do the split, then you cannot really calculate these properties. And just to give you a little bit of like history about the development of the field of networks, this all comes from from back in 1735, when this guy Leonard Euler, the same guy who developed the mathematics behind the E number, was faced with a famous mathematical problem that is called the bridges of Königsberg. And the problem there was to find a way of crossing all of the bridges without crossing anyone twice. And he sort of, I put some links there if you are interested in further reading. So, and since then, so he realized that he could like represent this as, as a network. And then since then, the field of graph theory has developed many tools that we will be relying on. And then as the field evolved, these sort of tools have been applied to many different disciplines. And the first sort of instance in which this happened in ecology was back in the 1880s by a guy named Lorenzo Camerano, an Italian ecologist who realized that he could sort of represent species and their interactions, and this is, the actual drawing, the first sketch of a food web that is found in the literature. For those of you who have read The Origin of the Species, this might resemble, Darwin's first sketch of a phylogenetic tree, and to some extent it is, only that you are representing different information, right? Over there, you are representing relatedness between, species that have that are descendants of other species. Here, you're representing ecological interactions. So ever since then, within the ecological networks literature, a lot of researchers have used this sort of approach and this way of thinking about these communities to as I said in the sort of introductory presentation, to try to better understand, better characterize those objects, those networks, to see how we can learn more about ecological communities by calculating these properties. And what we're going to do now is to see how we can actually represent these networks, these graphs in our computer, and how we can, not only in a computer, but like in general, what is the representation that we can use? Because obviously, these little pictures are nice to look at, but we are not going to be working with this directly, right? We need ways of representing this and being able to actually quantify stuff. And this is what we are going to do now. Do you have any questions so far? Anything you want to say? Nothing? Please talk more. So the sort of most common representation of a network, or let's make this more interesting. What do you, when you think about having, a set of things that are related to one another or have an interaction between one another, what is the, like thinking as a mathematician, what do you think would be the easiest way to represent this in mathematical form? Yeah. Yeah, the graph is this, but if you were to process information in a graph, what would be the, yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that is the most common thing that, the most common way in which we will represent networks, right? So we will have a matrix in which each of the elements inside it are going to be the interactions between the species. And these interactions can be either binary, so there is an interaction or there isn't, or it can be actually quantified. So for example, if you've seen how many times some bee visited a flower, then that information can go in there. Or if you know how many prey items a predator consumed, then that information can be in there. And there are specific ways of using that knowledge as well. So for example, if we had a food web in which we have a top predator, an intermediate consumer, and let's say 2 plants. And we have, this is 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then all of the other elements would be 0 by default, and there will be an interaction between 1 and 3. Oh, sorry, I made a mistake. So you have a 1 here, then 3 and 4, then 2 and 4. And yeah. And there you have like a 3, the 3 elements in your matrix. So the interesting thing about this is that it will be very easy to calculate things on this, right? How would you quantify the number of links in this network? Sorry? Yeah, exactly. So counting the number of links, it's just doing a sum on the matrix. Whereas if you had this, then you would have to do a for loop or whatever to go over each node and see how many, etc. So you see how flexible this kind of representations is, right? Because it gives you a way of doing this very fast. And we will be relying on that for some of my examples here. So what do you think would happen to this matrix when we have a bipartite network? Sorry?
It could be symmetric.
It could be symmetric, yeah. Sorry? Yeah.
Maybe it takes place like block diagonal or something like that.
Yeah, it will be a block diagonal. And if you have a matrix with that characteristic, how do you think we can make it more efficient? So occupy less space.
Only store things that are not zero. It's as far as making.
Yeah, but I'm looking for like I want to make the matrix smaller, not only sparser, but smaller.
Thinking about like plants and bees, put the bees in columns and the plants in rows?
Exactly. So instead of having all of the species in rows and all of the species in columns, then you're going to have one set of species in rows and the other set of species in columns, right? So you will have here plant 1, plant 2, and plant 3, animal 1, animal 2, and animal 3. So if you had this, then Benjamin was right before. If you had a representation like this, then all of your interactions would be like in like a block matrix in each side of the network. And in this way, instead of having a 6 by 6 matrix, you compress it to like a 3 by 3 matrix, right? And the difference between these two matrices, at least in ecological networks, I am not entirely sure if it's like a general thing. This one here is called Adjacency Matrix, because it sort of has the information of who is adjacent to whom. Whereas this representation here is what they call an incidence matrix. Because here, basically, the focus is on this interaction from this species. It's incident on that other species. So it gives you like a sort of directionality. You cannot, in here, represent like the interaction going the other way around. So you cannot have you can have the interaction from P1 to A1, but you cannot have A1 to P1, right? I mean, you need to assume that that same element can encapsulate the whole information that you need. Cool. So, and this is, you know, we can see easily here that in ecological networks, depending on your system and the questions you want to answer, we can rely in either of both of these two things, right? We can use this for some stuff, for some systems. We can use this one for some other systems. And as I said, there will be, you know, different properties that we can calculate. Do you have any other questions or anything you want to? Yeah.
You used the word nestedness a while before. Could you define that for us?
What is that, sir?
What's nestedness?
Yeah.
Could you
well,
define
I'm going to probably talk about it like later on,
okay.
But yeah. I don't know if maybe I can answer now or... Yeah, no, let's do it later because it will make more sense with other properties. So one other kind of network representation that some computer programs use, and that is also a more succinct way of, because for example, if you have a very big matrix with a lot of zeros, you can either use the sparse matrix or you can use this thing, which is called an edge list. So you just you know, you just write the pair of species that interact in two columns, basically, and then you can use, you know, like for example, libraries in R or you know, mathematical tools to analyze the network in that way, or to build the network in that way. The important thing is that regardless of the representation, either that edge list or yeah, either this edge list, yeah, or this adjacency matrix, you are always going to get this network here, right? And then, you know, aside from these sort of, let's say, minimalistic representations, then you have like a whole set of new formats that have been emerging relatively recently for keeping information, for keeping more sort of metadata of your network, right? So for example, in a food web, if you want to store traits of the species, like body size or, I don't know, metabolic rate, or, you know, like traits or features of both species and the interactions, then, for example, there is this, this format here called GraphML, which is like an XML for keeping network data. Have you guys come across XML? Do you know what is that? Yeah. So yeah, basically XML is sort of formatting language that is commonly used in websites and things like that to keep, for example, if you create a Google map thing with points, locations in, I don't know, where you took pictures and you want to download that, that would be an XML with the coordinates of each of your points and what you saw there, etc., all the information you want. So this is sort of equivalent to that, but specific for graphs and network data. So yeah, having known, you know, the sort of things that that networks are and all that. Now I'm going to jump into like providing some examples of specific metrics that we use to quantify network structure. And for doing this, I will be relying on networks that I took from publicly available databases. If you are interested in more networks, there are the global databases out there, like for example, the Global Food Web database or the Web of Life. And you can download all that data and start playing around with to see what you find, properties, maybe use what we look at today and try to calculate your own properties on your own networks, things like that. And this is how you can download the data, in this case, as an edge list for in this case, the Benguela or Benguela ecosystem, which is in South Africa. And then you can, read the network in this way and then represent it as a matrix. And here I show how you make all of the matrices, all of the elements of that matrix into ones if there is an interaction. So all the stuff that we have been talking about, but in this piece of code, so you can play around to see how it's done. Cool. So one of the stuff that we can or we're interested in calculating within not only networks but in our community is the number of species. So to calculate that in a matrix, in the case of R, you just take the dimension of the matrix, and that we will call S as the number of species. And then, as one of you said before, the number of links is simply the sum of all the stuff in the matrix. And if we are looking at bipartite networks like this one, then to be able to calculate these properties, we need to do it a slightly different way. Because to be able to know the number of species, we need to sum both the number of rows and the number of columns, as in here. So in here, I am using a fish anemone network from that database. All of those data sets, by the way, are referenced in here. So if you are interested in going back to the source, it's there. We first calculate the number of species in one trophic level, then in the other, and then the number of species is simply the sum between those two things. And the number of links is, even in an incidence matrix, is still the sum of the entire matrix. Cool. Do you have any questions so far? Were you able to install the library and run all these codes, and is it working okay? Yeah, cool. So then we have that S as the number of species is the dimension of your matrix, the number of links is the sum of your matrix. In this matrix, each Aij is equals 1. There is interaction. And if it's equals 0, there is no interaction. Cool. So there are some properties that are going to be hard for us to calculate, from scratch on the matrix. So as I mentioned before, we are going to be using a lot a package that is called iGraph in R. It's also available for C and Python. We are going to represent those matrices as actual network objects in the computer. And here I show you an example of how we can, create networks in that way. This is just for you to see how you can actually quantify properties. So the first thing to be able to quantify these properties is to have the network in the computer, basically. So if you're interested in like building the network from scratch, then we need to first create a vector called species, then create a network by adding the vertices, the species as vertices to the network, then create an interaction from one species to a different species, and create any other interactions. So this is what I have done here. So you can see how to, and then once we have that, we have our network in this object called network. If you don't want to start building everything from scratch, then you can just have a matrix representation in your, in your local machine, and then just read, as we did before, read the matrix from the source file, which again is the same one as on top, and use this function here, graph.adjacency, here to create again the network in our computer. I'm gonna skim through this relatively quickly because these are just technical details. But while running this code you run into any problems, please let me know. The interesting part comes after we already have the network represented in our computer. All good? Yep. Cool. So yeah, once we have the network, we managed to read the matrix into our machine. Then we can start doing things like this. We can just plot it, which is very easily. We can also make some formatting adjustments to the plot, like if you want a different layout, or if you want to add the arrows to the links and all that. So all of that is in the documentation of the. Were all of you able to load the network on your machines? Yeah, all good, cool. So, I mean, if you don't want to actually run the code, it's fine. I mean, you will still be able to follow the rationale, but this is just for, again, I think that my aim here is that you not only are listening to the stuff that I'm saying, but you actually do it yourselves, and it feels more like you are involved in the whole process. So the first, one of the first sort of properties that we are interested in ecological networks, and that you will see in many papers out there, is what they call connectance or connectivity. Connectance is basically the fraction of realized links out of all possible ones. So what would be the number of possible links in this matrix or in any network? What do you think is the maximum possible number of links? Sorry? N times n minus 1 divided by 2. Yeah, I like that way of thinking. Yeah, that is if you, I mean, that is correct technically if you don't account for cannibalism. So if there are no, if you don't have loops in any of your nodes, and if you assume that the links only go in one direction. Did everybody get that? Yeah, cool. So technically, as I said, technically that is correct. The thing is that in the network literature, well, at least in the food web literature, not many people are as specific or accurate as you were. So a lot of people just quantify the basic version of that. So what would be the most general case if you were not going to remove those type of links? Yeah. So it would be S squared. So S squared is the number of all possible links in the network. And then since we are interested in, this suddenly starts going loud. If we're interested in the fraction of all possible links, I mean the realized between possible links, what do we do? We just count the number of links that the network has, which in our example was L here, and we divide by this number, right? So that is what in food webs and in ecological networks in general we call C, or connectance. And as I said, you are going to find the connectance as a property of ecological networks in many papers in the literature. So let's now think about what would be the connectance in a bipartite network, right? Because this is assuming that you have all of these interactions in this adjacency matrix. How would you quantify the number of possible links in a bipartite network? Remember that here basically what you did is that if n is the dimension of the square matrix, what you did was basically n squared, right? So how do you think you can quantify the total number of potential links in a bipartite network? Sorry? I can't hear you. Yeah, exactly. You multiply the dimensions. So if you have n and m, then the total number of links would be n times m. So if we name here n as a species of plants and m species of animals, then we have that the total number of potential links here is species of plants times species of animals, and L is the same thing as before because we just sum the whole number in the thing, and this is the connectance in the bipartite case. Sometimes here we impose one of the constraints that, sorry, what's your name? Sorry? Thalys. That Thalys was talking about. So sometimes you might see this as S times S minus 1. Sometimes, but not all the time. They don't go as far as the half, dividing it by half that he was proposing, but yeah, nothing is perfect, I guess. Cool. So in the case of when we have the network represented in our in our iGraph thing, then there are two convenient functions to do this in iGraph, which is eCount and vCount. You use that as in here. So the connectance is eCount, which is the number of links in your network, divided by vCount squared. Then another property, yeah?
Yeah, but we're assuming, you said that the adjacency matrix can also account for like the number of interactions that you see. Instead of being binary, it could be like abundance of then how would this look like?
Yeah. No, in a quantified case, the connectance would still be the number of available links. There are like a different set of properties that you can calculate like on top of that. I mean, there are like weighted versions of connectance that you could imagine, but yeah, I don't know, for some reason it's not very used like in food webs and things like that, so It's not common to see. Yeah. Cool. So yeah, the other sort of property that people sometimes, it's very related to this, but it's more, I guess it's easier or it's more straightforward to think about when looking at the node level rather than the network level, which is the average number of links per species. And that is just, L divided by S. Again, it's very straightforward because it's very similar to connectance, but it gives a sense of more like localized property, because it's about if you take a node from the network at random, how many links would you expect it to have on average, right? So again, it's just L divided by S. And I mean, this property in the network, in the food web literature, is sometimes called linkage density, or just mean number of links per species. Cool. So yeah, I hear you will see that in this page I just ramble about a bunch of things, and I explain the rationale for things. So you are welcome to read, all the stuff about connectance in bipartite networks and how it's calculated that way. But I'm not going to go into all that detail here. So here we have the example for, how to calculate what we spoke about. Yeah, perfect. Okay, cool. Now this is more specific about, what we are interested in. So in ecological networks, we are interested in two broad classes of properties. One that I have termed here horizontal diversity. So if you imagine your network, as a, like as in here, as an object that it can be both wide and long. Horizontal diversity means how diverse things are, from one to the next in their, from one to their neighbors, right? And in particular, we are interested in what we call generality, which is basically another way of saying diet breadth. So how many species a predator or a consumer consumes, right? And that is very easy to quantify because it's just the in degree of a species. Do you guys know what is the difference between in degree and out degree? No? Okay, cool. So going back, yeah, I guess I should have explained that before. Going back to our example of the network here. So imagine that this is a food web in which the first level are the basal resources, so plants, etc., and so on, normally, usually. Here you have like the first consumers, so first consumers, and then here are the top predators, right? The number of links that a node has, it's what in a network or in a graph is called its degree. So degree, when I say degree, or well, when the literature says degree, is just simply the number of connections that a node has. So for example, the degree of this guy would be 1, and the degree of this guy would be 2, right? What do you think would be the degree of this node? Sorry? 3, yeah. But then now you see that there are arrows. There is like a directionality. So biomass is flowing from here to there, right? So that's why we can have a distinction between in degree. Anyone care to adventure a guess of what is in degree? Very straightforward. Yeah, incoming links, exactly. That is the precise definition. So any arrow that is pointing towards you, it's an in degree. And then obviously the other thing, the opposite would be the out degree, which is, so thinking about an ecological community and interactions, what do you think in degree means? Imagine, it's coming to you. What do you think that means? Sorry?
It predates you?
The other way around. You get the biomass from. So in degree, usually, it's what we quantify as the generality of the species, because the in degree of this node, which is 2, is the number of prey that it's consuming. Do you see that? Yep. So we are going to call from now on generality as the in degree of a species, or how many links are going to that species. So, and as I said before, it's equivalent of to the diet breadth. So the diet breadth of a species, it's in degree. And then we have another related metric, which is called vulnerability. So how vulnerable you are, which is the number of out links. So your out degree is your vulnerability. So what would be the out degree of this node here? What would be the vulnerability of this node? 2. Yep. And what about this guy? Yeah. And then if I do this, what would be the, this might be a tricky question. What is the out degree of the top predator? 0. Yep. So here you can see that now that we know the degrees and the difference between in degree and out degree, we can tell which type of species you are by doing that. So what do you think is the defining feature of a basal resource, of a basal species? Exactly. Its in degree is 0. So you can calculate, I can give you this thing and you can tell me how many top predators you have. Then you just quantify the degrees of all the species in the network, and whoever has an out degree equals to 0 is a top predator. Whoever has an in degree equal to 0 is a basal resource. If you have both either out degree and in degree different than 0, then you are what we call an intermediate species. So you are a consumer somewhere in the middle of the network, right? Yep. Yeah. Yeah, usually to quantify these things, you remove the loops before doing that, because otherwise, yeah, it would be, well, these rules wouldn't be true, basically. Yeah. Cool. So here I provide a few examples of like functions to calculate both in degree and out degree, and you can use those for for calculating properties in your networks. Cool. So let's see. One of the properties of the networks and the species within it is that, as we will also see a little bit below, is that these networks are very heterogeneous. I mean, not all, it's not a property of all the networks, but of many networks in the real world and also food webs. We will see that they are very heterogeneous. And by this I mean that nodes are very different, or different types of nodes are very different in their connectivity profiles. So there are a lot of nodes with a few links, few nodes with a lot of links, some are intermediate. And one way in which we can quantify that is by analyzing the standard deviation of both their in degrees and their out degrees. So what do you think the standard deviation of the generality, for example, would allow us to quantify? Thinking about communities, right? Like, to some extent, but I'm looking for a more specific answer. Like, what if you have like the standard deviation of in degree? What does that tell you? It gives you like some sort of measure of how variable are your species in terms of how much they can eat, right? It tells you whether you can have in your network very generalist species, like, I don't know, a lion, and at the same time harbor a very specialist species. Like, for example, I don't know, Darwin's moth, right? Something that only eats that thing. Because it quantifies how variable or how different these in degrees are. And this is important for networks because it is interesting, or it's let's call it good, although it's not technically the term, but it's good for a network to have this variability. So networks, ecosystems usually have species that are very generalist and some species that are very specialist. And this metrics allow us to quantify to what extent that is the case. So what is the variability in the diet breadth in the species in your community? And also what is the variability of the vulnerability? So how many predators they have the species in your community? Yep. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah,
Oh, okay, so I was talking in the mic. I didn't understand the standard deviation when you see the in degree doesn't show. If I have a small standard deviation, doesn't mean that I only have specialist species, but I only have one type. So only specialist and only generalist. Okay. Yep. So if I have a high standard deviation, because I was thinking it won't mean that I have more generalist, but that's not what it shows. It's that I have more variability in those types of links. That's it.
Yeah, that is, one aspect of what you are saying is that the standard deviation, if it's small, it will tell you if you have only specialist or only generalist, but it won't tell you which one it is. So you need to look at this property with, along with, for example, connectance or the total number of links. Because if your connectance is high and your standard deviation is low, then it means that everyone is a generalist, right? Whereas if your connectance, if the standard deviation is still low, but connectance is low as well, it means that you have a lot of specialist species. All good? Yep. Perfect.
Why is it good after all that
The microphone thing, it's a bit annoying, right?
Why is it good after all that there is a great standard deviation of, because if you had a lot of generalists, would it be bad for the ecosystem? I don't.
Yeah, I didn't want to get into but it's an interesting discussion, so I'm gonna talk about it now. Basically, something that we are not gonna be talking about in this course, but that it's very prominent in the ecological networks literature, is what are the properties that make ecosystems stable, right? And one of the things is that for an ecosystem or a network like this, or networks like this to be stable, they need, what has been shown is that the number of general species needs to be small compared to the number of specialist species, right? So if you are trying to quantify whether your system is similar to those structures that provide stability to the community, then this kind of things is relevant, because you sort of try to sort of make the argument that your system is it complies with these characteristics. The other thing that is important for networks to be stable is that the interaction strength between the species are usually weak. Again, we are not going to be going into detail here, but if you are interested in these things, I have a link in one of the lectures after this. I didn't sort of anticipate that we were going to jump into these like more complex topics in this lecture, but yeah, I can refer to that link so you can see all of the different properties that that networks that are more stable, sort of, and this is the way in which you could quantify some of the things that make networks more stable. Yeah. But yeah, in general, I mean, based on that literature, you could say that having all generalist species is bad, because one of the key results in ecological theory is that the stability of a network decreases sharply with the number of links it has. All of this comes from like random matrix theory. So if you are interested in this, we can talk about it like after the thing, and I can show you some papers in which they have shown this. But basically the sort of accepted relationship is that for a system to be stable, the average number of interaction strength multiplied by S times C has to be smaller than 1. So if you, the more connectance you have, so the more generalist species you have, the less likely that system will be stable. Yeah. Cool, that's very interesting. Yeah, that's exactly what I am looking for, that you guys start asking hard questions. Cool. So the other kind of things that we can calculate in networks is not only how diverse they are like horizontally, but how diverse they are vertically. And one of the reasons why we might be interested in doing that is because one of the classical hypotheses in like a community ecology is that more productive systems should be able or are able in general to maintain higher trophic levels, so that the food chain is longer, basically. So you have more productivity, so you have more basal species. Then this in turn feeds into the herbivores, and you have a larger sort of suite of herbivores, which can maintain more consumers, and then they can maintain more predators and so on. So we are interested in understanding what is the shape of our network in terms of the vertical diversity. And to do that, we usually look at the fraction of the different species across the 3 different trophic levels. So what is the fraction of basal resources? What is the fraction of intermediate species? And what is the fraction of top species, top predators? And we also look at what we call the mid-food chain length, which is, for those of you familiar with graph and network theory, it's sort of a derivation of a classical metric used in networks, which is the mean path length or the shortest path length. Basically, what we are trying to do here is calculate the shortest path length, but between 2 specific types of nodes, which are the basal resources and the top predators. So we are going to calculate all of the possible paths from each basal resource to each top predator, and then average all of those paths. And that is like a classical metric that we quantify in food webs, which is the mean food chain length. So MFC. for mid-food chain length. What was I gonna say? Yeah, I here provide some examples on how to do this in in the code. So, for example, to be able to calculate the number of basal species, the only thing you need to do is to, or the fraction, sorry, the only you need to know is to see which ones. Remember what was our rule to identify basal species? Yeah, exactly. So here we identify which species have an in degree equal to 0 and which species have an out degree larger than 1. Those are basically the number of basal species, and then we just divide by the total number of species, and that is the fraction of basal species. And the same goes for intermediate and top predator. Obviously, once you have 2 of them, you can calculate the other because their sum is equal to 1. So you don't really have to calculate each one separately, but you have the code there to do that. Cool. Do you have any questions so far? Nope. All good. So here I give you like the sort of way in which we, when I am calculating properties of networks, I just summarize all the properties in this way, and then after that you can do all sort of things like plot these properties against something else, like environment, whatever, and in that way you sort of analyze how networks of different types vary with whatever might be your variable of interest. And here is like an example of how, so as I was saying, the mid-food chain length thing comes from the average paths in networks. That is like a classical problem in network topology and things. And luckily for us, we can do this using some libraries that are available to us. In particular, I will be relying on this library here called Chatter. And here you can see how the mid-food chain length is calculated in this. I mean, I am not providing the algorithm to actually calculate mid-food or the shortest average paths, but that is done internally by the library. But it's important that you, even though you do it using a prepackaged library, it's important that you understand the rationale for this. So did all of you understand what I meant by mid-food chain length? Cool. And this is important, because of the reasons I explained before about, the productivity of the system, how much vertical complexity it can harbor and all that. All good? Yeah.
Just one question. If you have more than one top predator, do you calculate for each of those and then average them out?
Yeah, you need to calculate all of the paths between each basal resource to each top predator. Yeah, it can, for very large networks, it can be very, very time consuming. So like I have a student here, I have a student now who's trying to do this for a network with, I think 1,100 nodes. And yeah, she cannot do it even in the big desktop that she has. So it can be a hard problem to compute, yeah.
If there's more than one path?
What is that, sir?
If there's more than one path from one node to the other, how would we choose?
Yeah, you need to calculate all the paths from, as long as they start from basal to top and finish in top, you need to calculate all potential paths. So here would be, so this would be 2, then this would be 2, then this would be 2, then this 2 as well, this would be 1. Yep. So, and for example, if you had another one from here to here to here, then you have 2 and 3. So, no, sorry, 2 and 2. So it would be, in this case, it's sort of easy, but if we had like, a more sort of complex network here. Then going from here to here would be path 2, then here would be 3. So 2, 3. You could even go like through here, and then you know, like through here and then through here. So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4. So all of those you quantify 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus whatever, all of the others, and then you make the average of those numbers. Cool. And finally, I guess the most interesting property of all, like, I mean, up until now it has been sort of you know, relatively easy sort of properties, but as I said, sorry if it was a bit boring, but I think that now we sort of understand each other. Now you're going to know what I mean when I say generality, vulnerability, mid-food chain length, you know, network, adjacency matrix, all of that. So that's good. But here is the, you know, one of the things that really, that is really sort of, it goes to more, to try to explain important properties of networks. And that is the degree distributions. So the degree distribution is interesting because in different types of networks, from technological to social to, you know, the internet, even the network of airports across the globe, and not only within networks, but also in all of different kind of phenomena, like for example, the magnitude of earthquakes, the size of cities across the world, all of those things, and also the relationship between area and number of species, as we will see tomorrow. All of those things have been shown that they follow what is called a scale-free distribution. Do you guys know what is scale-free distribution? Cool. So when you plot the distribution of something, do you know what is a distribution? Yeah. In the sense of like statistical thing, like a histogram of things that you count. Cool. So, and then you, I mean, it's easy to see how the degree distribution, well, sorry, what would you think is the degree distribution in a network, given what we learned today? Exactly, the frequency of the degrees, the frequency distribution of the degrees, right? So if you take that frequency distribution and you quantify it in many different networks, it turns out that across all of these networks, as I said, the internet, the airports, electrical circuits, the brain of a little sort of worm that they use, gene networks, yeah, your Facebook contacts, all of that, they follow a scale-free degree distribution, which basically means that the ratio between very connected and not so much connected nodes, it's constant across the entire range of values in the network. And one of the ways in which you quantify scale-free networks is by characterizing the power of the power law in the distribution. So in this case, in the case of food webs or ecological networks, it's not always a power law distribution. It's not a perfect power law distribution. It's more like a truncated power law, like in this example here. So you see that, you know, you have a lot of if k is the degree of a node, and here is the probability with which you will find a node with that number of links, then you see that in the case of our network above, you have all of these. You know, a lot of nodes have like at least 10 links, but then this decreases sharply and the highly connected nodes are very few. And one of the reasons why people, so in the networks literature, this has been attributed to the way in which the networks form. So many of these networks are suggested to have been formed by a process that is called the rich gets richer. Have you ever heard of that? Which means that when a new node enters the network, it is most likely, or the new connections it will create will be a function of the degree of the nodes that are already on the network. So if you get into a new network, if you get into a new social group, you are more likely to make friends with the guy or the girl who is already very popular, right? So, and this sort of, and there is a lot of literature on this. If you're interested, you can, you can read about that. You can ask me. And this sort of like developmental process of the network creates networks that are like that. And it turns out, and also in ecological networks, that this property is very good to prevent the destabilization of the network against random attacks. So if you attack a network randomly by trying to remove one node at random, if the network follows this structure in the places where the links are, then your network is going to be very robust. But the downside is that it's very fragile against targeted attacks. So if you manage, if it's easy for you to identify who is the most connected node, then that attack, it's very damaging. That is why the scale-free property or the power law in a degree distribution in a network is important. And that's one of the reasons why we quantified in food webs. Because if our food webs follow, our network follows that property, then extinctions of random species are probably not going to be that bad. But extinctions of key species, like, for example, very connected top predators or things like that, are likely to be very damaging, right? And it has been, again, as I was saying, I think that I put some references here. This reference is, this reference here, Montoya and Pym in Nature, 2003. It's 2006. It's a nice introduction as to the fragility and robustness of networks of ecological networks attached to that property. And as I said before, it's also interesting in general because it's a pattern that is recurrent across many systems. Like, for example, the number, so the size or the magnitude of earthquakes that have been experienced in any area of the world are known to follow a scale-free distribution. The number of, the size of cities in terms of populations also follow distributions of this kind. So it's like a sort of universal pattern that is also found in ecological networks. And it's one of the things that we quantify when studying networks. The way in which you quantify that is very straightforward. I leave here the code for you guys to have a look at. But basically, it's just as you would normally quantify the frequency distribution of any data that you have. So here you have the number of the degree of your node, how many of each degree you have, and then you divide by the sum of all of them, and then you get that little plot down there. If you're interested in this scaling thing and scale freeness, so the direct consequence of this is that in this kind of networks that display this power law degree distribution, then the ratio of very connected species versus less connected species is the same regardless of the scale, right? And by regardless of the scale, what I mean is that if you look at a network, at the ecological network of the entirety of Brazil, for example, which might be a very big network, and you look at the network of only the state of Sao Paulo, for example, which is expected to be a smaller network because it's a subset. So the ratio of the very connected species to the less connected species, it's always the same because they share this property. And then all the implications that I just mentioned about the robustness and the fragility of the network. So yeah, tomorrow I'm gonna try to keep talking about this in the context of spatial scaling of networks, like how we understand better how networks change from local to regional scales, and we are going to learn a little bit about spatial ecology in the process. All good? Cool. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure.
I was interested to know